One Sunday morning on July 15th, 2018, a mother was standing just outside a laundromat, talking on her cell phone, while her children played a few feet away under her watchful eye. Video surveillance captured an elderly man calmly approaching her, pulling out a knife, and without saying a word, launching a frenzied attack before she could react, stabbing her repeatedly as her children watched in terror. Alerted by her screams, onlookers rushed to the scene, restrained the man, and called emergency services. Sadly, by the time first responders arrived, it was too late. The attack had been fatal. Investigations were carried out, and the detectives uncovered the dark history of this man, which left them in shock. This is the heartbreaking case of Kimberly Dobbie. Kimberly Dobbie was born on October 17, 1969, in the lush suburb of Concord, near Boston in Massachusetts. She graduated from the Bromfield School in Harvard and earned a certificate in early childhood education from Lesley College's Threshold program in Cambridge. After completing her studies, Kimberly worked as an assistant teacher at Alston Brighton Head Start for several years, before returning to Harvard to raise her twin sons, Cole and Dylan. Due to the high cost of living in Massachusetts, Kimberly eventually moved to Farmington, Maine, to seek affordable housing and independence, according to her mother. Those who knew her appreciated her kind and gentle nature. She was known for her warm smile, quick wit, and friendly demeanor. Close friends described her as energetic and positive, the kind of devoted mother who kept whole wheat crackers in a bag for her sons and would search tirelessly for a World War II textbook when one of them requested it for his birthday. Kimberly loved the beach, and Christmas was her favorite holiday. Her twin sons were the light of her life. While staying at the Hope Haven Gospel Mission in Lewiston, Kimberly and her sons frequently visited the local library. There, she used the computers while her boys read and played with the provided toys. Unfortunately, it was at this library where she crossed paths with an evil man called Albert Flick. Albert Flick was an Army veteran who had worked at the same donut shop in Westbrook, Maine for 19 years. A background check on Flick revealed that he had stabbed his wife Sandra to death on January 31, 1979, just 3 weeks after she filed for divorce. Sandra, who had endured an abusive marriage almost from the beginning, had finally reached her breaking point at the age of 35. Despite knowing the risks, she decided to leave Flick for good. Anticipating that her husband would react violently, Sandra contacted the Westbrook Police Department and requested an officer to be present when she served the divorce papers. She also asked for Flick to be escorted off the property to ensure her safety and that of her 12-year-old daughter Elsie from a previous marriage. Thanks to the police presence, Sandra's attempt to legally end the relationship proceeded without incident. On the day of Sandra's murder, Flick visited the apartment, ostensibly to collect some of his belongings. Since he seemed calm, Sandra allowed him to come in and take what he needed. However, once inside, instead of gathering his things, Flick pulled out a knife. As he brutally stabbed his estranged wife, he repeatedly professed his love for her. A terrified Elsie witnessed the entire scene through a crack in the door. Fearing she would be next, the young girl ran to a neighbor's house and asked them to call the police. Despite suffering 14 stab wounds, Sandra managed to stagger into the hallway. Before succumbing to her injuries, she told the neighbor that Albert Flick was the one who had attacked her. When the police arrived, they found Flick standing in a daze, his hands and clothes covered in blood. Flick was tried and convicted of Sandra's murder. During the sentencing phase, his family members testified as character witnesses, describing him as a good man whose terrible actions stemmed from an abusive childhood. Flick was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but was released 9 years early for good behavior. This early release didn't surprise those who knew his tendencies. Since his aggression was exclusively directed toward women, and there were none around to provoke him, he had behaved meekly in prison. After his release, Flick's issues re-emerged repeatedly. In 2007, he was arrested for hitting a woman he was dating and, according to the victim, for stabbing her with a fork during a confrontation. 3 years later, Flick assaulted another woman by hitting her with the butt of a knife and then chasing her with a screwdriver. Fortunately, the woman managed to escape with minimal injuries. When the police apprehended Flick, he had attempted a half-hearted suicide. After receiving a relatively light punishment, he quickly returned to his old behavior. Later that same year, Flick was arrested for domestic abuse and criminal threatening, with a deadly weapon after stabbing a woman with a steak knife. Despite recognizing Flick's history of assaulting women, the judge believed that, at nearly 70 years old, he would eventually age out of his violent behavior. District Attorney Catherine Tierney disagreed, asserting that Flick, who had never shown any remorse for his crimes, had no intention of changing. She argued that he wouldn't improve with age because inherently bad people like Flick couldn't recognize their own flaws. Ultimately, Flick was sentenced to 8 years but was released in 4. Once again, the justice system failed to account for the entirety of his criminal history. Upon his release in 2014, the 72-year-old Flick reportedly began stalking one of his former victims, confronting her in public and threatening that she would get hers. Despite his parole officer describing him as extremely violent toward women, Flick's poor old man act prevailed once more. Instead of receiving a lengthy sentence, he was returned to prison for just 2 years for violating his parole. Besides murder and assault, Flick's extensive list of offences included witness tampering, likely due to his habit of threatening those who pressed charges against him. A dangerous individual by any measure, Flick repeatedly proved to be a menace to society. Unfortunately, his lack of moral character was overlooked by the legal system. Flick had been living with his nephew in Lewiston when he met Kimberly by chance at a local library. Kimberly, a mother of 11-year-old twin boys, was homeless and staying in a shelter, and the library was a place she visited frequently during the shelter's off hours. Instantly infatuated with the outgoing woman who was everything he was not, Flick went out of his way to win her favor. He believed that the fastest way to a woman's heart was through her children, so he occasionally treated her boys to healthy lunches that she couldn't always afford. Catherine Cormier, a shelter resident who became close to Kimberly, noted, "Kimberly was just plain out of money, and any mother is going to accept that." Soon, Flick became a constant presence in Kimberly's life. Although it was clear to everyone, including Kimberly, that he wanted more than friendship, she made it clear, as gently as possible, that it was never going to happen. Determined to win over the object of his affection, Flick pursued Kimberly incessantly, trailing her like a shadow. Hunched and hard of hearing, he appeared everywhere she went, whether winding through the library shelves or lurking near the bus station while she waited. Tired of his constant presence, Kimberly finally put her foot down and asked him to leave her and her children alone, firmly rejecting his romantic advances. However, this only seemed to intensify his obsession with her. Around this time, Kimberly received news that an apartment had been secured for her and her sons in Farmington, an hour away. Overjoyed at the prospect of having their own place, the family began preparing for their move. When Flick learned through the grapevine that Kimberly was planning to move, he was furious. Instead of accepting the situation and moving on, he decided that she wasn't going anywhere and he would ensure it by any means necessary. 2 days before the murder, Flick bought a paring knife in preparation for his plan. On the morning of Sunday, July 15th, the day before Kimberly and her twins were set to leave Lewiston, video surveillance captured her standing just outside a laundromat, talking on her cell phone while her children played a few feet away. In a harrowing moment, the footage shows an elderly man calmly approaching Kimberly, pulling out a knife, and without saying a word, launching a frenzied attack before she could react. He stabbed her repeatedly, trying to end her life as her terrified boys looked on. It was a cowardly act driven by spite, executed by Flick without a hint of regret. Alerted by her screams, another laundromat patron, visiting businessman Dennis Fisher, rushed to her aid. Without regard for his own safety, he charged at the assailant, knocking him to the ground and holding him down until the police arrived a few minutes later. While they waited for help, onlookers comforted Kimberly, who was bleeding profusely but still conscious in the moments following the attack. When first responders arrived, they quickly began efforts to stabilize her. Unfortunately, despite everyone's best efforts, it became clear that she was beyond saving. As her body was being loaded into an ambulance, the crowd that had gathered in front of the laundromat comforted her twins, who had witnessed every horrifying moment of their mother's murder. The perpetrator of the unprovoked attack, 77-year-old Albert Flick, was taken into custody and charged with Kimberly's murder. Detectives soon discovered that the victim and her killer had once been on friendly terms. Flick, a regular presence at the library, had a knack for appearing whenever Kimberly and her sons were there. Rather than being put off by his somewhat intrusive presence, Kimberly had felt sorry for the lonely old man who enjoyed making small talk while piecing together jigsaw puzzles. What Kimberly didn't know was that this seemingly harmless elderly gentleman had a long criminal history dating back to the 1970s. In the aftermath of her murder, it was revealed that Flick had a disturbing hobby that he enjoyed far more than working on puzzles. His preferred form of stress relief had always been stabbing women. Before that tragic day in 2018, when he killed the innocent mother in cold blood, Flick had spent a third of his life incarcerated for crimes against women. Unfortunately, Kimberly was unaware of this disturbing fact, and like many others, she saw no harm in this man who had an uncanny ability to conceal his hatred for women. Well, at least for a while. Those who survived his attacks knew too well, Flick could only pretend to be benign for so long. Once his true nature was revealed, no woman was safe. On July 17, 2019, after 40 minutes of deliberation, a jury found Albert Flick guilty of Kimberly Dobbie's murder. 3 weeks later, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Barring any further strokes of luck, he will spend the rest of his days in a prison cell where he undoubtedly belongs. Albert Flick lacked empathy and remorse for his actions, a common trait in what many call a psychopath. His perception of women as mere objects suggested a deep-seated misogyny and a complete detachment from any moral responsibility. It is sad and unfortunate what all the victims faced against this monster. As we reflect on this heart-wrenching tale, our thoughts are with the victims whose lives were tragically cut short and the loved ones they left behind. If you found this video compelling, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel and check out our other videos. Thank you for watching.